Uh, you have on your website the anti portfolio, which I think is interesting because I talked about characteristics, and obviously it doesn't hit all the time, but I think it's a nice homage to all the people that you haven't invested in. But it's funny. I mean, some of the likes of Facebook have approached you and whatnot. Curious, maybe a story that you missed on, and where you look back and where you think their qualities may have stood out, be missed. But what is a good way for one of these investors or these founders, excuse me, to pitch you, communicate what they're doing with their business with you, and how possibly to pitch a VC?
Yeah, so there are a few questions I'll try to touch on both. First, on the anti-portfolio, it's perhaps the most commented on portion of our website. If you haven't seen it, a former associate of Bessemer's from well more than 20 years ago, probably close to 30 years ago, after working a couple of years at Bessemer, he predated me. He left and became a writer for Harper's Magazine. He was a very talented writer, and he created the first anti-portfolio, which tends to be, which is a list of sort of, in hindsight, sort of funny stories about why we didn't invest in certain companies. And famously, we passed on investing in Federal Express, I think 7 times, as an example. I've got a couple of the stories up there, one of which related to Facebook, as you alluded. And I like to think I had met with Eduardo Saverin. I ran into him it was actually at a McKinsey recruiting event of all places. And I thought he was crazy, and I told him his idea was nuts and that Friendster had already won that market and he should move on to something else. I like to think that if I'd met Mark Zuckerberg instead of Eduardo Saverin, maybe I would have reached a different conclusion, but we'll never know. I think what's important, though, is that we're ultimately judged by what we do, not by what we don't do. And so I think we continue to publish the anti-portfolio because we think it's a bit of an act of humility. The truth is, like, we don't always get it right. In fact, we probably get it as often wrong as we get it right. But our goal is not to get it right every time. It's just to get involved with enough great companies early on, if we can, to help those entrepreneurs and to build a great business for ourselves. So that's the anti-portfolio. In terms of what to do, like I said earlier, I think it's really hard for anyone to assess another human being in a short period of time. I kind of view the entrepreneur venture investor relationship as like a marriage, and generally speaking, it's a few weeks to a few months between when we meet an entrepreneur and when we invest. Occasionally, it's many years that has happened, but oftentimes it's shorter. And I think it would be very difficult if most of the judgment had to be on the person and nothing else. It would be akin to getting married after having spent a few weeks or a few months with somebody. That happens, and some of those marriages last many, many decades. But my guess is spending a little bit more time to learn about somebody before making such a commitment probably yields a better result. And so for me, it's less about the person, though of course that's important, and instinct comes into play there, and much more about the idea. And so the thing that I look for when I'm meeting with an entrepreneur is an insight. And so if there's a specific business idea that seems interesting or compelling or logical on paper, but there's no specific sharp insights, I get much less excited by it. But if there's an insight, and the insight is about something that I didn't know before, I didn't understand before, I think is clever or possibly unique and maybe even a secret, that's what gets me really excited, because that becomes the intellectual property, if you will, or the magic sauce that gives that young startup a real chance of succeeding against a much bigger incumbent. Anyway, so that's what I'm looking for. So if you yourself as an entrepreneur aren't sure what your insight is, I would say, well, maybe you've got the wrong idea, or maybe you got to think more deeply about the idea so you can articulate what the insight is. If it's just a good idea that's not built on or buttressed by some really noteworthy insight, then it's much less likely something that I'm going to want to invest in.
That's good. As they communicate the insight to you, and they've won you over, or they've won over any other VC, your fund is notorious from taking companies from seed to A to B to IPO all the way up there. C, obviously, whatever it may be. When that founder who's watching this right now communicates that to the VC, can you give us a little bit of a breakdown on how you look at the funding stages, and then how they should be leveraging the VC in between each stage, and how the cadence of communication, just kind of what you're looking for and how they can best leverage the VC's network or whatever it may be, but that process.
Sure. So that varies wildly across founders. And so I sort of feel like it's my job, once I've made an investment, to do whatever I can to help the founder succeed. I've got some founders, in fact, one in particular, founder of a super successful business that's in excess of $1 billion in revenue, who I talk to almost every day. And then I've got other founders who are also really successful, who I might talk to every couple of months. And it depends. In my mind, there isn't a fixed model. My job as a venture capital partner is to figure out what's going to be useful to that entrepreneur and serve him or her, as opposed to do what I think is important or what I want to do. I've got a few key principles that I always talk to entrepreneurs about before I invest. And if they're not willing to sign up to those principles, then I say it's probably not going to be a fit, so let's not do this. But the first principle is treat me like a partner in the business. And anytime something bad happens to the company, tell me right away, like in the same day. If you're not willing to tell me the bad things right away, then I'm going to feel like you're hiding something from me. But more importantly, it means I have no chance, if you don't tell me about it, to help make it better. The flip side is, I say, when something good happens, that's like cause for celebration. Whenever you feel like getting around to telling me about it, that's fine. I'd love to celebrate with you, but that's not obviously urgent. But if something bad happens, you got to tell me right away. Once you stop telling me right away, it means then you're managing me and you're managing my image or impression of the business, which isn't what I want. I want to be able to help you. So that's core principle number one. And then core principle number two is, I want to be informed enough about what's going on that if there's a question or a challenge or an opportunity that you're contemplating, you can call me up and get useful information from me or opinions from me without having to spend like 3 hours to bring me up to speed. And so I ask for a regular cadence, and in some cases it comes in the form of a phone conversation. In other cases it comes in the form of a report or written materials, sometimes authored by the founder, sometimes by a whole bunch of people in the company. But I kind of want to know what's going on so that when a critical moment pops up, I already have all the context. It's not about then catching me up, or worse so, if something comes up, I don't want a founder to be discouraged from reaching out to me for a point of view or a piece of advice, because that's like a 4-hour conversation necessary to first catch me up to speed. But that's kind of it. And then I say, if you want to talk all the time, feel free. If you want to talk almost never, that's okay too, as long as you comply with those first two principles. And then once in a while, I'll come up with an idea or a suggestion, and I may reach out to pass it along to a founder. But my expectation is not that the founder is going to act on it. It's just a piece of information. I go by the invited guest principle. We as investors aren't making decisions. We aren't driving the company. We aren't telling anyone what to do. We're there to be helpful. We may have ideas, but sometimes those ideas are bad ideas. And the founders who are just going to listen to everything I say, they're not the ones I want to back either. I want to back founders who have their own strong opinions and deeply held convictions. And more importantly, can screen out a random idea from a person off the street or even a big investor. It almost doesn't matter. Maybe the last thing I'd say is, I find that somewhat cynically, most of the value a venture capital investor creates for his or her fund is in choosing which companies to back and which entrepreneurs to be in business with. Some of the value, but a much, much, much smaller portion of it, comes from the help the investor actually applies or supplies to the companies. And the reason why I say that is pretty simple. I spend probably half of my time meeting with entrepreneurs for building companies that I might invest in. And I spend roughly the other half of my time trying to assist in some way, shape, or form my existing portfolio of investments. And I have, like most venture capital partners, 7 to 12 investments at any given time. So call it 10. And so I try not to do tons of work on the weekend, so inevitably I find myself doing some. But in a given month, if there's 25 work days, I'm spending about half of it looking at new investments and half of it working on helping portfolio companies, which means sort of 12 days divided by roughly 12 companies is kind of a day a month. And so if I'm able with any specific company to provide so much help by working on that for 1 day a month, relative to the founder and management teams of those companies who are probably working on it, 16, 18, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, then the people working at the company must suck. There's no way I can be so insightful or helpful spending 1 day a month on anything relative to people who are working all day long. Now that said, there are occasions when I happen to know the perfect person at some potential partner, or the perfect new investor who could supply the company with capital, or the perfect lender. And so sometimes in really short bursts of time, we as investors can be remarkably helpful. But over an extended period of time, multiple years, there's just no way that the amount of time an investor is putting into a company can wildly move the needle relative to the effort and energy applied by the team. And so I think one of the challenges that some investors have is they delude themselves into thinking they're so important, or even worse, they delude the entrepreneurs and the management teams into thinking the investors are so important that their ideas, when they spend maybe a day, a month thinking about a company, are somehow better or more likely to be good than the ideas of people who are equally, if not even smarter, and certainly know a lot more about the business and the industry than they do, who are working on it all day long. So that's sort of my cynical view of investors. I think being honest about that and knowing where you can be helpful and where you're unlikely to be helpful is really important.